Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm your host, Bridget Burns, Executive Director of the University Innovation Alliance.
And I'm Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, I team up with a journalist who is almost always Doug to talk with a sitting college president or chancellor or a leader of an important organization to talk about them as leaders, to hopefully instill a sense of wisdom and perspective to give you some hope to last throughout the week. So that's why we call it Start the Week with Wisdom.
And, as Bridget's sidekick, I'm pleased to welcome today. And I just found out that he had this title, but he was deemed to be one of the 50 greatest leaders in the world, and probably, since there isn't an intergalactic version, probably the universe, according to Fortune magazine. He's long known in a lot of higher education circles for his prior role at Georgia State University, where he oversaw student success, a very wide domain. He's now launched the National Institute for Student Success at Georgia State. Welcome, Tim Renick, to Weekly Wisdom.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Bridget and Doug.
We are super excited to have you. And today I'm debuting the Madonna mic for you. So this is going to be a big episode. Got a lot of songs.
You've always been a star with me, even before the mic.
So we usually try and kind of set the table and get a sense of where folks are. So just how are you holding up right now? You've spent the last year navigating very interesting terrain in student success, and then also making a transition. So how are you hanging in?
Yeah, it's been a very challenging year, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. So that's very encouraging. I mean, now our plans for fall at Georgia State are looking more like plans for fall in previous years, as opposed to last year at this time when we didn't know what was going to be the nature of the classes we were delivering and who was going to be where and so forth. So that's encouraging.
Right.
Tell us will you tell us a little bit about your new role and sort of the transition that you are making?
Yeah, so starting last November, I became the executive director of the new National Institute for Student Success at Georgia State. For 5-6 years, we had a steady stream of campuses come to visit Georgia State, often for a single day. Some days we were hosting 90 guests on a single day. We'd put on a whole show for them. We would do talks and take them through our advising center and connect them with our data teams and so forth. It was all very useful and quite well received, but there was always the request for more, right? After you bring a group of people to campus and learn about the predictive analytics and microgrants and all these sorts of programs, then inevitably you want to go back to your home campus and begin to implement. And we never had the bandwidth really to help campuses through that process. So in its simplest form, the National Institute for Student Success is going to kind of fill that need, where we will help campuses work to identify their own institutionally created barriers to student success and introduce evidence-based methods of removing those barriers. So it's exciting work. We already have some partner campuses we'll be working with beginning the end of summer and into the fall. And we think it's a way to make sure that these kind of approaches, which are not Georgia State approaches, they're just kind of good commonsensical approaches building upon evidence-based practices over the last decade, that these become the norm rather than the exception in higher ed.
That's great. I feel like people are always asking, like, what does this mean? Where's Tim going? And I'm like, it's that basically he gets to actually do the thing that everyone expects and asks him to do all the time, and it's not a side hustle. So we're excited for you to be able to give it your actual focus. You wanted to talk about his.
So I guess, Tim, the thing that's interesting to me, you have built a whole career, especially in this portion of it, and you're doubling down now on student success and on sort of carrying that through, helping it ripple through higher education. A lot of times there's a tendency in higher ed, as well as other industries, for people to constantly move sort of up rungs of the ladder. And I'm suspecting and I have a sense that you have had opportunities to become provost, a president, et cetera. And I'm curious sort of what has led you to follow the course you're on. We try in this podcast, Bridget, to talk about leadership and how people can navigate careers. And I think yours is an interesting path in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Doug. I have had the opportunity to become a university president a couple times in the last few years. And, in both cases, I turned down that opportunity because I thought that, I could make more of a difference in my current role. I mean, the reality is that I know a lot about student success. And one reason I'm constantly asked to do public speaking engagements, and one reason we have had now about 500 campuses come to visit us to look at our student success programs, is there's not that much information out there about how you actually implement and bring about and scale, large scale data-based interventions to support students. That's a kind of rare, if not unique, skill set. Whereas, if I were to assume a presidency, I'd be asked to be doing that maybe 5% of my time and 95% of my time, other sorts of things. And so my belief was, even before this notion of the National Institute for Student Success came about, is that, this is what I'm good at, and this is where I can make a difference. And my voice will probably be a lot louder as a national representative of these student success approaches than as another, president among hundreds of other presidents out there.
So just is it just to try and sort of tease it out for people, is it about understanding both yourself and what you want to accomplish? I mean, is that sort of, is it, what are the factors? Is it both, again, looking inside and also thinking about what you want to get done in the world and where you can have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think it's a little of both things. It's looking inward and saying, where do I really find my satisfaction on a day-to-day basis? I love the work we do in student success. There's nothing in my career I've been prouder of. I love talking about it. I go out and talk 100 times a year because I think this work is so important. It gets me enthused. And then I look at, and I've been very close to presidents and presidencies and so forth, what you do on a day-to-day basis as a university president, as a large public university. And some of that I would love doing, and a lot of that I wouldn't love doing very much. So part of it is that internal thing, but the external part of it is, what do we need right now? What is needed in higher education? And do we need another president kind of learning the ropes, which I would definitely be, or do we need, people to up the ante and up the standards for how we talk about student success? And I think there's much more demand for the latter than the former.
You and I've talked about this over the years, and I just always thought, like, if I had to decide between the greatest contribution that you could be making, if I mentally am thinking about you on stage or coaching an institution to improve student outcomes versus being in a skybox at a football game talking to donors. And I was just like, one of those feels like not the best use of your talents. And so this is something we've talked about quite a bit. So
yeah, I never quite evoked the skybox image, but I think that was in the back of my mind. Exactly right. Yeah, meeting with donors and meeting with politicians and so forth. There are others who can do that better than I can.
Great. So I'm curious about you talked about what you love to do, and one of the things that is very noticeable about an element of your leadership is you're an incredibly compelling communicator. You're a great storyteller. But when people would often be like, why is it so great? I was like, he's actually like a distinguished lecturer, and it comes directly out of your work as a faculty member. But what I want to understand is, there's also something about telling that underdog story that feels like it's really in alignment with who you are. But I don't actually think you have shared your personal connection to or your background connected to the underdog story of Georgia State. I think you often just focus on the students, but could you share a bit about that now?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I had the privilege of going to very elite institutions when I was doing my own degree work. So I got my bachelor's from Dartmouth, from Princeton. But when I arrived at Georgia State in fall of 2008, I immediately felt that this was much more home than those institutions, because I spent most of my life as kind of an outsider. I grew up in a very wealthy North Shore community right outside of New York City, North Shore of Long Island. Not because my family was wealthy. It's my dad was career military, but because he happened to be stationed there, and we lived in this area where, the kids around me had a world that I had never seen before, and I rarely experienced even while I was going through school there. And then I went off to Dartmouth. I did well in high school in my outsider role, and kind of felt like an outsider again, because most of the other students in my dorm were, gone to private schools. Until I got to Dartmouth, I didn't even have the concept there was such a thing as private high school that you go to. But many of these kids had gone to prep academies. I was work study, or the equivalent thereof. From the first semester, I was working in the dining hall. My first assignment working at Dartmouth was in the dish room, as they called it. The conveyor belt would bring the dirty dishes in from the floor of the dining room, and I'd have a rubber spatula and scrape the plates off and so forth. I was comfortable in those roles. I'm not, complaining about it in any way. It was something that, kind of came naturally to me. And I think it provided a lot of really useful experience for my later leadership roles. By the senior year at Dartmouth, I was one of the managers of the entire dining hall. And half the people I worked with were my fellow work study students. The other half of the people I was working with were the townspeople from around Hanover, New Hampshire, the people who had full-time jobs in the dining hall, and navigating the differences and communicating with these different audiences, and, kind of building a common sense of purpose and so forth, was something that I worked on, while I was still literally in my undergraduate time. So when I went off to Princeton, again, it was a great privilege. I had a great education, but I never felt truly at home there. When I came to Georgia State, where 75% of our students are non-white and 60% of our students are low income, and everybody almost is working to get through college, I said, yeah, this makes sense to me. I identify with this.
That's great. I appreciate that. I'm glad that I just feel like people haven't gotten a chance to get that sense of your story. We are getting a little bit of internet lag from you, Tim. So I don't know if you have anything else that's open. But Doug, did you want to go on to?
Well, I guess I'm interested in the following up on that. I mean, there are. I'm curious kind of where your thinking has evolved. We've obviously seen the last year has been an incredibly difficult one for year plus has been an incredibly difficult one for so many people. And I'm interested in kind of how you view the pandemic and the recession and the moment we've just come through as having we've seen, the enrollment data that just came out in the last 24 hours or so about the spring continue to show certain populations really struggling more. And again, unsurprising which ones they are, because they're the ones who struggle pretty much whenever anything bad happens in our country and in our society. And I'm just curious sort of whether you believe the pandemic has been a good thing or a bad thing, and not to oversimplify but for the focus on student success. It's obviously impaired student success in certain ways just because it's harmed students and made their lives more difficult. But I'm curious sort of how you think we're coming through this, and whether you think there's made potentially increased focus on the importance of it. I don't know how you see that balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a dialogue out there about what we want to hold on to that we learned from the pandemic, and what we will kind of go back to pre-pandemic. And I think the overarching message I would take away is it underlines the importance of developing these kind of systematic student support systems that don't require the initiative of students to be helped. I mean, we need to be much more intentional about delivering personalized services to students on a daily basis without them asking for these services. And in a nutshell, that's what Georgia State's done over the last decade with our predictive analytics and proactive advising and chatbots. And, you know, we've given out over 20,000 proactive micro grants, no application required. You know, what these systems, which were developed pre-pandemic, tell us is that, you know, we can't expect students, especially from low-income first-generation backgrounds, to both master all of the academic skills that are required to get a bachelor's degree and at the same time figure out this insane bureaucracy that we've created in higher education with FAFSA forms and transcripts and applications and majors and registration holds and so forth. So what Georgia State has tried to do through the use in many cases of technology, or at least its assistance, is take the burden off of students having to navigate the bureaucracy. We don't make the courses any less rigorous than they ever were before, but let's make the figuring out how to do college a lot less complicated. And so I think what the last 12 months have shown is how important that is. Just one very specific example is last April, when we got our first federal stimulus money, the CARES Act money, and we're instructed to deliver half of that money to the students directly. We set up two means for the students to access that money. We set up an application like every college and university did across the United States, apply for emergency aid and we'll give you some of this money. And over the last 12, 14 months, we've had about 6,000 students that have availed themselves of that, have taken the time to fill out an application and get a federal aid from that pool. The other thing we did is used our existing systems, the same systems we use to give micro grants to students who we find are at risk of dropping out, with no application required. We're looking at students with holds on their accounts, with high balances, high levels of unmet need. They don't need to come to us and tell us they have financial need. We see they have financial need. All our systems are telling us they have financial need. And what we did is just put the money directly, the federal money directly in their accounts. We've done that over 60,000 times in the last 14 months. So by a ratio of 10 to 1, you know, we've distributed the money proactively as opposed to waiting for the students to fill out some bureaucratic form and go through yet another hurdle. And more than that, what I'll say from years of experience is the students who have the bandwidth to overcome the bureaucratic hurdles are not always the most deserving of the aid. By definition, they have the bandwidth, so they're a little better positioned than those who could never even conceive of finding the time to figure out how to fill out emergency aid form and even know that that money is available to them. So, you know, if there's a good thing that comes out of the pandemic when it comes to student success, I hope it is that campuses that were left entirely flat-footed over the last 12 months. I had some campuses reaching out to me last April saying, how do you advise students when they can't physically come in and sit across from an advisor? Because they had no video advising systems, no proactive outreach systems set up and so forth. The campuses that have invested historically in those kind of approaches were the campuses that weathered the pandemic better, but also the campuses that are going to be much stronger as we work our way out of the pandemic. And as we recognize that the nature of students has changed so much in higher ed, more and more students are parents, more and more students are adult learners, more and more students are part-time, low income, so forth. These are the kind of approaches that these students need in order to succeed.
Well, I feel like that's super helpful. And I think folks are already giving great perspective on their thoughts on how this is a great conversation. So I wanted to shift to focusing on even more on you as a leader again, because I just feel like there's no one who has heard you speak about student success more than me. And every single time that I hear you speak on student success, I learn something new, and you know that. But again, I also know you personally, and I feel like you as a leader, it's very interesting to me how your leadership has evolved. The way that you start your career as a faculty member, you move your way up at Georgia State, and slowly over time, because of your, I think, quiet leadership style, patience, I don't know, you over time, assemble a very massive portfolio that I think helped you with implementing student success innovation. It's one of the things that when I look at other campuses and presidents are asking kind of like, what's the hot tip that they could take from your example, I'm always kind of looking like who gets fired if student success doesn't improve. And there doesn't seem to be someone who's actually in charge in the way that your position, and now Dr. Allison Calhoun Brown is in, Senior Vice President for Student Success. I think that's a novel concept, but it only happened because you over time built that. And so I've seen you lead in that way. I've also seen how people at other institutions around the country follow you. And then I've also seen people above you somewhat defer on leadership. So I think your leadership style is in itself really interesting. And then now you're in an entrepreneurial role, but could you share what you think are the most useful skills that have helped you be able to lead in all these different spaces towards this important goal?
Yeah, that's a great question, not an easy answer. I'll say this about autobiographically, that I came to Georgia State as the first hire in religious studies and was assigned as a junior faculty member. I was only 25 years old when I was hired by Georgia State, straight out of my PhD program, to start this religious studies department. It was an uphill climb, right? So from the beginning, I had to use a whole host of skills to try to gain buy-in from colleagues, from administrators, from people who held budget purse strings and so forth. I'll say kind of what I've learned then, and then I applied in even greater degree when I began overseeing the student success efforts in 2008, is maybe two skills. One that is particularly important and that everybody knows about is, using the evidence, using the data. We're noted at Georgia State for paying attention to data, and anybody who's heard me speak knows that you'll get a lot of data from me, but it's not just a curiosity. I mean, it is an intentional aspect of how I present things to academic audiences. Maybe if I was speaking to an entirely different audience, the data wouldn't be as important. But when you speak to audiences of skeptical faculty, staff, administrators, and so forth, most of whom have a whole string of degrees at their end of their names, they need the evidence. And if you're asking them to do things that are utterly different than what they've done for the last 20 years of their careers, then you better have good and compelling evidence. So we've been very intentional from the beginning. I did this as I was building the religious studies program, and I did this as we were building up student success at Georgia State, to have not only good data available, but to have confirmed data, to hire independent evaluators. When we launched our chatbot at Georgia State in 2016, that very first summer, as we were launching it, we also made a call to Lindsay Page at the University of Pittsburgh, a leading summer MELT researcher, and said, will you run an RCT of this first trial we're doing this summer, so that we'll have good data in order to make a compelling case. So that's one side of it. The data is not incidental or is not some quirk of my personality. It's part of what we're trying to do to convince our fellow people in higher education that they need to change. The second part of it, which maybe gets less attention, is my subfield in religious studies is actually religious ethics. So I taught comparative religious ethics. I taught courses in war and violence. I taught courses in church and state and so forth when I was a full-time professor for 20 years of my career. And what I think I've done more intentionally and maybe more overtly than a lot of other people who speak in academia is make the moral argument, right? I mean, it is a moral argument. And the reason many people are attracted to higher education in the first place is because of the moral mission. I can tell you, I hear it every fall as we bring in new faculty and staff to Georgia State, that a main reason why people come to Georgia State is because they want to make a difference. And they want to make a difference, especially with low-income students and students of color and first-generation students. So, be out there and say, yes, what we're doing is the morally right thing to do. And if we don't do this, if we allow students to come to our campuses and drop out with debt and nothing to show for it, that's wrong, right? That's immoral. And not every audience member will kind of take up and be inspired by the same data points. I make ROI arguments as well. But I think what is underestimated when you're speaking to a group of your colleagues in higher education is to recognize that most people could have done other things, and they chose higher education because they believe in its moral mission. So make the moral arguments and show why what you're doing is the morally appropriate thing to do.
It's really interesting because I've been spending a lot of time recently talking about demands for higher education to prove its value, and that focuses more on the non-moral part. And it's pretty interesting to hear. I don't hear a lot of talk about of the sort that you're doing, and it's different and kind of refreshing, I have to say.
Well, don't get me started on the ROI side of it, because I can go on for 45 minutes or an hour about how these programs pay for themselves, because they do. But I think there's a lot of people thinking now about how you make those kind of very practical arguments. I think, Bridget's question was about how do you get people to actually follow and be inspired? And I don't think it is predominantly the practical ROI argument. I think it is, these people came here for a reason as faculty and staff, and this will help you fulfill that mission.
Yep.
And it aligns with when I go to other institutions, when the leader really can appeal to something that's like a very intrinsic values-based appeal. For instance, define not by who you exclude, by who you exceed. Like people, it gets them moving in that direction. They're deeply inspired and passionate. I want to turn back to something that I do think is pretty different about you, and I'm hoping you can give us some advice on how you develop this. You have a level of patience and just like dogged determination that you will go through. First off, you spend the amount of time and energy that you can spend on data is unparalleled. And so I want other people to do it, but I also just, I think people get kind of overwhelmed over time. They maybe, move on to a different thing, or I'm not sure what it is, but somehow you have been able to stay so focused and be so patient when focusing on some of these longer term data-driven improvements. And I'm wondering, where did your patience and your kind of resilience come from?
I'm not sure I have an easy answer to that. I do think part of it comes from being, or at least perceiving myself as a bit of an outsider and not expecting things to kind of be handed to me. But the attitude I take is kind of the same attitude of sales. Our point in student success is not to find something or make an argument that turns a switch that takes, graduation rates that are 35% and turns them to 100%. What we're doing on a day-to-day basis is trying lots of different things, some of which may be successful, others which will be entire failures. And if you're a salesperson, selling cars or houses or whatever, and take the view that it's not worth my time, energy, and so forth to go out there today because there's a good chance that what I'm doing is not going to result in a sale, you're going to go down in flames, right? It's going to be a disaster. What you need to do is recognize that there's a certain proportion of the efforts that you engage in that will bring back these returns. And with that expectation in mind, it's enabled me to go through a lot of things that haven't been successful and find the ability to continue going on by those 1/3 of the things that really do work out and produce great results. I'll tell you, being at a place like Georgia State with 50,000 students, of which 80% have immense needs, academic, financial, emotional, so forth, it can be overwhelming, right? Because there's so much deserving attention that the students need. But if we can plug away and do things every day that make life a little better for some of the students, then over time, every year and every 5 years and so forth, you begin to see those results in a very gratifying sort of way. I mean, Georgia State is now graduating 3,500 more students than we were just 10 years ago. Every year, 3,500 more students. None of those efforts that we had, none of that data analysis or these pilots and so forth, resulted perhaps in more than a few dozen here or maybe a dozen there additional graduates. But you do that day after day and year after year, and a decade later, it's 3,500 more students every year graduating with their degrees. So, I can't say that explains why I'm patient, but it does explain what my outlook is and why I'm willing to keep plugging away even when not every day is a success.
All right. Well, we only have like 1 minute left. So these are rapid fire last two questions. One is the best advice that you have received, and the second is the advice you most frequently give to others when they are thinking about leadership. Do you have answers to those two?
Yeah, I think the advice is, everyone who you network with is a future ally, and don't burn bridges. That a lot of people, treat their leadership roles as an us versus them and as a confrontation. And I've always had the view that whenever possible, you build strong relationships, you agree to do things even if you don't immediately see the personal benefit, because those relationships pay off in the end. And I think my career is testimony to that. So that would be the advice that I got, and maybe it's the advice I give as well. But the other advice I give to anybody watching today is, there's a whole realm of opportunity for career development in the field of student success. The whole term student success didn't really even exist a decade ago. So the idea that you can be a leading administrator at a university and overseeing these kind of efforts and programs and coordinating them, so forth, is a very new enterprise. So I encourage people to really take that seriously. And just because there's not a lot of examples out there, don't assume there won't be many, many more examples over the next decade, because I think this is definitely the direction higher ed is heading.
Well, that is perfect. And so thanks so much for sharing your insights and perspective, Executive Director Tim Renick. Folks can look up the National Institute for Student Success. We'll link that below, and you can be able to look a little bit more into how your institution might work with them. Doug, as always, thanks so much for being an excellent co-host. And for those of you at home, we will look forward to seeing you on our next episode.